Hello and welcome. The current dominant global grand narrative, a grand narrative being a comprehensive story that explains the meaning of history, culture, and social dynamics, is that shaped by capitalist ideology, reinforced by legal frameworks, prioritizing property rights and market stability over ecological stability, democratic participation, and social fairness. Capitalist ideology is one based on the belief that economic freedom, private property, and competitive markets lead to prosperity and innovation. One where wealth accumulation and personal economic success are seen as key indicators of merit and hard work within this system. Implicitly, this ideology is driven into the psyche through indoctrination by education, media, law, and political rhetoric, as of benefiting and for the well-being of all, when in fact it is for a parasitic minority, feeding off the demise of our home, planet Earth, and the enslavement of our bodies, minds, hearts, and our very souls. While democracy is widely proclaimed as the cornerstone of modern governance, the current grand narrative functions largely as a legitimizing discourse that obscures the deeper economic imperatives driving global systems. Through critical analysis of political economy, international law, and institutional governance, we reveal how the rule of law has been co-opted to serve capitalist interests, marginalizing alternative visions of collective welfare, participatory democracy, and economic justice. The paradox of China's embrace of capitalist mechanisms within an authoritarian political framework is also explored as a revealing case study of capitalism's ideological flexibility and global reach. 1. Introduction. The grand narrative of the modern world is often articulated as a triumph of liberal democracy, human rights, and rule-based international order. However, a closer examination reveals that the true engine of global governance is capitalism, with legal and institutional structures designed primarily to uphold the private capitalist relations of production and accumulation. According to the World Inequality Report in 2022, those benefiting most from the capitalist ideology are those in the top 10% who own 76% of the wealth, with the poorest 50% owning just 2%. And capitalist ideology is the root cause of growing inequality. Here we explore how the rule of law has become a vehicle for the entrenchment of capitalist norms, often at the expense of substantive democracy and fairness. 2. The grand narrative and its capitalist foundations. The post-Enlightenment, materialist, global narrative presents liberal democracy and market capitalism as mutually reinforcing systems of freedom and prosperity. This narrative was cemented during the Cold War, positioning Western liberal democracies as the ideal political economic formation. However, this synthesis is not neutral. Capitalism has provided the foundational logic around which legal and political institutions have been constructed, privileging private property, private ownership, contractual freedom, and market-based solutions over redistributive justice and democratic control. From Bretton Woods, an international monetary and financial system established in 1944 by 44 nations, the system was designed to create a stable, predictable, and cooperative post-war economic order, primarily focused on exchange rate stability and international trade, to the Washington Consensus, a set of 10 economic policy recommendations favoured by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, World Bank, and the US Treasury for developing countries, particularly during the 1980s and 1990s. These recommendations generally emphasise free market, meaning free from political and therefore democratic, policies, including trade liberalisation, privatisation, and financial liberalisation. Global economic integration has consistently privileged capital mobility, privatisation, and deregulation. The result is a world order where democratic legitimacy is subordinated to the imperatives of economic growth and investor confidence, primarily for the few, and this is enshrined in law. 3. The rule of law, instrument of capital or democratic safeguard. While the rule of law is widely regarded as essential to democratic governance, its contemporary deployment often serves the imperatives of global capital. Laws regulating international trade, e.g., WTO rules, investment protections, e.g., ISDS mechanisms, and intellectual property rights, e.g., TRIPS agreement, overwhelmingly favour corporate interests and limit the regulatory sovereignty of states. In domestic contexts, the sanctity of contract law and protections for capital accumulation are embedded in constitutional and civil law traditions. Legal systems are routinely mobilised to criminalise protest, suppress labour organising, and facilitate resource extraction, reflecting a deeply unequal balance of power. As Katharina Pister, 2019, argues in The Code of Capital, law is not merely a neutral arbiter, but a key architect of wealth concentration for the few. 4. Liberal democracy as a legitimizing ideology. The democratic facade of capitalist societies often functions as a mechanism of consent rather than genuine participation, so much so that any genuine consideration of modification to or suggesting an alternative to capitalism is immediately quashed or ridiculed by the system, rather than being held open to true democratic debate and dialogue. Indeed, the workings of the global economy, such as the role of money and government debt, are held shrouded in mystery and are the domain only for economists who support capitalism. Electoral politics are increasingly dominated by elite interests and corporate lobbying, undermining the principle of popular sovereignty. Media conglomerates shape public discourse within narrow ideological bounds, reinforcing capitalist realism. The idea that there is no alternative to the current order, which must be defended at all costs. And these costs are substantially borne by the poorest in society, in turn for safeguarding the wealthiest. The popular term representing the foregoing is Neoliberalism, a political and economic philosophy that emphasizes free trade, deregulation, globalization, and a reduction in government spending. According to Hajun Chan, a professor of economics from the University of London, the origins of neoliberalism date from the 1800s, and originally the neoliberalists were totally against democracy, and solely for the wealth of property owners, who were the only ones who could vote, and in 1833 represented only 18% of British men. The neoliberalists of the late 20th century had increased power represented through the policies of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and whilst they outwardly accepted democracy, they did everything they could to weaken or even eviscerate it. As part of their facade, they supported independent institutions such as central banks, IMF, WTO, etc. But independent from what? Independent from politicians and from democracy. As Wendy Brown, 2015, argues, neoliberal rationality has hollowed out democratic institutions, turning them into instruments of market governance. Elections without economic democratization are insufficient to produce fairness. They merely redistribute symbolic power, while real decision-making remains in the hands of unelected technocrats and financial elites. 5. The paradox of China. State, capitalism, and the global order. China presents a compelling paradox in the global narrative. Officially a communist state governed by a one-party system, China has embraced capitalist markets, foreign investment, and competitive accumulation. Since Deng Xiaoping's reforms in the late 20th century, China has integrated deeply into the global economy, becoming both the world's factory and a hub for technological innovation. However, this integration has occurred under strict state control and an authoritarian political regime. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, retains monopoly control over political power while deploying capitalist mechanisms to drive growth. This hybrid model, often labelled state capitalism, challenges the Western assumption that capitalism necessarily leads to liberal democracy. Indeed, it can be argued that capitalism as currently operated is the antithesis to real democracy. China's success exposes capitalism's ideological flexibility. It demonstrates that the capitalist mode of production can thrive under a variety of political regimes, so long as the fundamental logic of capital accumulation, along with resource and labour exploitation, remains intact. This raises uncomfortable questions for the liberal grand narrative. If capitalism no longer needs democracy to flourish, what remains of the presumed moral superiority of the liberal order? Moreover, China's rise has prompted Western powers to re-evaluate their commitment to democratic norms when faced with competition from an authoritarian capitalist rival. This has accelerated the erosion of democratic safeguards in liberal states themselves, as evidenced by increasing surveillance, nationalism, and technocratic governance, as is currently unfolding in the United States of America and elsewhere. 6. Global governance and the reproduction of capital. International institutions such as the IMF, World Bank, and WTO do not operate democratically, but reflect the interests of powerful states and transnational capital. Structural adjustment programs, conditional lending, conditional on them operating neoliberal policies, and trade liberalization policies have entrenched global inequalities while eroding the autonomy of developing countries. The legal norms propagated by these institutions enforce a form of global constitutionalism that privileges market logic and capitalist ideology over real democratic choice and well-being of society and our home, planet Earth. The result is a global legal order that disciplines states into compliance with neoliberal norms while marginalizing voices from the global south and alternative economic models. 7th, alternative visions and suppressed narratives. Despite the dominance of the capitalist legal nexus, alternative political imaginaries persist. Indigenous governance models, participatory budgeting movements, degrowth economics, and cooperative enterprises embody different relationships to law, economy, and democracy. These alternatives, however, are systematically marginalized in mainstream discourse and policymaking, highlighting the hegemonic nature of the current narrative. Movements such as Occupy, Extinction Rebellion, and the Zapatistas challenge not only policy outcomes, but the foundational logic of global capitalism. Their suppression by legal and security apparatuses further illustrates how the rule of law functions to contain dissent and preserve systemic continuity. Yet these will be held to account as the world succumbs to resource depletion, climate catastrophe, and the inevitable social unrest that will follow. 8. Conclusion. The global grand narrative is not one of democracy and fairness, but of capitalism dressed in the garments of liberal legality and representative government. The rule of law, far from being a neutral arbiter, has become a central mechanism in maintaining capitalist dominance and limiting the horizon of political imagination. The paradox of China's rise shows that capitalism can dispense with democratic forms entirely, so long as accumulation of capital proceeds. True democracy would require not merely formal representation, but deep, structural transformation of legal, economic, and institutional systems to prioritize collective well-being over private accumulation,